I were to say space shuttle, Hunter, what is the first thing that pops in your head?
For me, the Space Shuttle Challenger,
Okay, what is
which
that?
that is the space shuttle that broke apart in 1986 with just, I guess, I have actually in my notes here, 73 seconds after launch. And this was among the crew was a school teacher, right? And so there was a lot of attention on that. The idea that, we've gotten to the point where we can we can train somebody who's not been trained as an astronaut for years and years and give them some training and they can be a part of this world of space. And so that amplified the tragedy. And so I was, as a teenager at the time, and this was a really big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a big deal. And so we're going to talk quite a bit about the space shuttle program as we launch into today's episode, because there's a lot to be said there. It really frames a lot of last week we talked a lot about the original space race, the Apollo program, all of that kind of stuff. But it's really the space shuttle program that's going to set the story for where we're at today, including some of the tragedies that go with that, which would include you said the Challenger, right?
That's right.
Because there's another one that has another name that we'll talk a little bit about as well. So
we'll get to that. Okay,
we'll get to that. We're going to talk all about that. But before we do that, let's just recap last week's episode. Now, these two episodes, you can kind of listen to them independently. They're not 100%, tied to each other, right? So last week we talked a lot about the original space race, a lot of the sort of implications around the Cold War, early rocketry, how everything sort of came together. So a lot of these scientists that were working together in collaboration, maybe not directly, but still in collaboration in order to get things up into space, and sort of some of the meanings that all went into that. And that's sort of where we'll kind of leave our recap today, because we have a lot of content to get to. But go back and listen to that if you want to listen to some of the early space race, I would say the first space race story, because it's really interesting. But today's episode is going to be about what I would say is sort of the modern space race, and they're kind of separate because there is sort of a gap in time here that the space race, as it is today, doesn't really have a direct connection to that early space race. Obviously, the technology is all connected and everything like that, but there's a lot more players involved. There's a lot more ambitions. There's a lot more things going on, including one country in particular that doesn't exist in its former form, which is the Soviet Union. And so,
the Cold War, you would characterize the first phase of the space race as being related to the Cold War, and then there's whatever comes after is something else.
Exactly right. That's kind of the break that I'm kind of talking about, right? It's Cold War versus not really Cold War anymore. I think there might be some arguments around sort of what Cold War means, but generally that's sort of the idea here. So we started today's episode with a question talking about the space program, Hunter, and so that's kind of where we're going to start our episode today, the U.S. shuttle program, space shuttle program. And so because we can't really start talking about the modern day space race without first talking about this program, because so much of what the space shuttle program has really defined sort of the modern era of space exploration, as well as sort of where we're heading with the current space race. And so, after the success of the Apollo moon missions, NASA begins planning for a reusable spacecraft. But we didn't talk about this last week, but all of those spacecrafts that were used, to get, people up to the moon and back and all this other stuff, they weren't reusable. They basically had to be discarded as soon as they were used. There was just no way to, refurbish them and sort of put them back up into space again.
So the space shuttle program is driven, one, by the desire to have a craft that can be used over and over again. And the hope is that will be less costly, and then also have a quicker turnaround time to get back into space. So that's the aspiration.
Exactly. It makes sense, right? When you can reuse something over and over again, not only does it make it, there's a logic here wherein, if you can build something once and you can reuse it to go up and down, the first time it goes up, and it works, right? You can generally be pretty, safe to assume that it's now a safe vehicle. right? Same thing with getting in your car. If you drive your car once and it breaks down, you're like, oh, this is a lemon. This is not a good car. But if you drive it once and it goes back and then you drive it again and it still works in 3 and 4 and 5 times, you now have faith in that vehicle to be a safe vehicle to drive. Same thing with the shuttle program, right? The idea was that each time, in the Apollo program, each time that they had to use one of these rockets and get astronauts up into space, they had to basically rebuild these vehicles. And when you do that, you're leaving open the, I guess, possibility that something during that manufacturing process can go wrong. The shuttle program was intended to reduce the amount of probability that something could go wrong during that manufacturing process, because again, you build it once, it goes up, it survives. Right.
The idea is we'll keep working.
Now that doesn't mean that there's not other issues at play that we've already sort of hinted at with respects to these space shuttles. So, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And so, shortly after the moon landing in 1969, the space shuttle program is officially announced by NASA in 1972. So it's just a few short years after. This is still during the Cold War, but at this point, it's largely assumed that the space race, as we knew it back then at the time, had largely been won by the United States. At least that was the messaging by the U.S. government. Who knows how that actually travels, within the Soviet Union, but that's sort of the messaging here. The Soviet Union, however, at this time, it's worth pointing out, would have similar ambitions, to have their own sort of space shuttle program, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But beginning shortly, after NASA started to design and test early versions of what would become the space shuttle, a reusable spacecraft with wings, right? The old rockets didn't have wings. That's sort of the defining feature, that would launch and then ultimately land kind of like an airplane does, right? So airplane aeronautics at this point, very well understood. If you can get something to land and come back and land like in a similar manner, that reduces a lot of the perceived issues again around getting astronauts back home. And so this work would culminate in the construction of the first space shuttle named Enterprise for atmospheric test flights. And the Enterprise was built in 1976 and would have its first flight in 1977, August 1977, I should say. And the last flight would only be a few months later in October 1977.
So it was designed not to go in space, but as a model, as a prototype for one that would.
Exactly. It was mostly designed to say, okay, can this design get up into air and land safely? Right. That was the entire purpose of the Enterprise. And so it was a success. The Enterprise, I have here the Enterprise, despite sharing a similar name to the famous Star Trek spaceship, can't not talk about Star Trek right now, would never actually go into space. It was originally intended to be retrofitted for space flight, but some later design changes that was made prior to the next shuttle basically made that impossible. And so you can visit that shuttle today at the Intrepid Museum in New York City. But just know that if you do go there, this is not a spacefaring vehicle. It's more of a prototype for what would become spacefaring vehicles. The first space-worthy shuttle would be built in 1981 and was named the Columbia. Are you familiar with this particular shuttle?
I am. I have memories from elementary school and a lot of attention being put on this. Yeah. And again, that's education, right? It's trying to indoctrinate students into thinking, all right, well, we're doing it right here, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the Columbia was the first shuttle. It was a phenomenal success. The shuttle would fly into space 28 times and circle the planet over 4,800 times. And so I guess the last statistic doesn't really matter that much because, once you're up there, you're up there.
Right.
That's not the issue.
I apparently go around the Earth pretty quickly up there. Yeah.
Yeah. But the fact that it went up 28 times is still, a pretty monumental effort, right? This was exactly what NASA wanted. They wanted a vehicle that could survive going up and down, because one, like you said, Hunter, is cost effective when you don't have to rebuild something from scratch every single time. And two, it's ensured the reliability of these vehicles, or so the idea goes. Unfortunately, in 2003, there would be a catastrophic accident that would occur with this vessel. So in 2003, upon re-entry from space, the Columbia shuttle would disintegrate. I believe there was some issues or malfunctioning of some panels on the underside of the shuttle, which if you've ever seen them come into space, they sort of land at a sort of tilt upwards, because the idea is that the atmospheric pressure and all that heat is going to pound into that reinforced area and absorb a lot of that. Apparently there was some issue where one of those panels was malfunctioning or chipped, or had chipped at some point, and therefore caused that destruction of
and once again, the whole crew was lost.
And once again, the whole crew was lost. Yeah. There was no survivors from that. And it kind of threw a wrench into a lot of the original thinking of, well, these are safe vehicles. And obviously we had already talked about the Challenger. That happened, quite a few years before this. But when the Challenger went up, it was definitely a huge tragedy. It was also kind of at the beginning of life for the shuttle program. And so while it was a huge tragedy and people were definitely taken aback by it, right? There had not been as disastrous of a space shuttle launch since probably the Apollo 1. Obviously, there was the Apollo 13 launch that we didn't really talk about last week, but there wasn't this kind of disaster where everybody perished in 1986. But it was also at the beginning of this program, and so NASA and the U.S. government, all these different agencies weren't ready to kind of throw in the towel so early. They were like, oh, the science is still working. At this time, the Columbia was still working properly, all of this other stuff. So, but the 2003 disaster was really the disaster that would spell the beginning of the end for the U.S. space shuttle program. And so the space shuttles, they would exist in some form up until 2011, but it was officially announced that they would be discontinued in 2004. They were now seen as older technology, less safe. They knew that there was a need to upgrade and have something new. And so
the original aspiration of having less expensive and quicker turnaround times didn't really end up happening. The research that I did suggests that the average cost, this is the average cost of a shuttle launch, was $450 million. And that the average cost for a rocket launch was a fraction of that, quarter, a third of that, or something like that. And also particularly, right. and particularly after the disasters, it took more and more time because understandably there would be safety protocols, and if something wasn't looking good, they wanted to check it out. And so that quicker turnaround time that they had anticipated didn't quite happen either. And so I think that some of the main reasons for having the space shuttle, it didn't really pan out. And so, and as you're suggesting, it was the Columbia disintegrating that we've got to do something else. We can't lose any more people this way.
Right. You can't lose any more people. And to your point, if it's not cost effective, then what are you doing? Right. And so, they would, like I said, they would still use the shuttles in some form up until about 2011. And at that point, they sort of called it and said, okay, we can no longer use it. And they would start to fly on Russian Soyuz.
Right. So it's interesting that they became completely dependent on Russian rockets to get into space for a while.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about sort of what that looks like today. We could talk a lot more about the space shuttle program, but instead of explicitly focusing on them, I kind of want to talk about. We're going to start talking about some private companies.
Okay.
And I think what I wanted to do was first talk about a company called Rockwell International. Have you ever heard of this company, Hunter?
I'm not familiar with Rockwell International.
The reason why I want to talk about Rockwell is because I think there's this idea that up until very recently, NASA and the U.S. government has been building all this stuff themselves, and private entities haven't really been involved, but they actually have been throughout this entire era. Space shuttles and Apollo, everything, right? And so Rockwell just provides a really good use case for us in our episode today to talk about private enterprises, involvement in the space race, which will help contextualize some of the companies that are around today. And so Rockwell was a major American manufacturing conglomerate. They were involved in aircrafts, space industry, defense, all this kind of stuff. But the reason why I want to talk about them is because they were kind of an omnipresent entity throughout much of the early part of the space race, as well as up until, a significant part of what we're talking about today, the shuttle. And so apparently they either developed or had a major hand in the direct creation of, for example, the P-51 Mustang fighter in World War II.
Okay.
The bombers in World War II, the Apollo spacecrafts directly linked back to our previous episode, the shuttles that we're talking about right now, and perhaps most geographically relevant to us, the original Navstar satellites that would become the GPS system that we use today. And so, again, while today's space race involves a lot of private companies, last week's episode and yesterday's space race, so to say, also involved a lot of private companies, Rockwell being a good example. And they were just involved in a little bit of a different way. And we're going to talk a little about what that means. But I wanted to highlight one example before we moved on, because I do think there's that idea that, well, we're in this new era where private companies are building all these own rockets, and that's so different and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, no, they were building them before too. They just weren't as visible. So let's spin the globe a little bit and talk about some of the other countries that are heavily involved in space exploration. We're not going to talk about them all, but there's a couple that or maybe there's just one that we really want to highlight because it's so intrinsic to today's space race, and that is China. And so we've talked a lot about the shuttle program. There's more that we can say about that, and there's a lot of achievements that go with that, but. And last week we talked a lot about the Soviet Union and sort of their achievements, but there's been other movements around the globe as well. And so China, they've been really active today, right? You don't have to look very far to see some of the space exploration achievements of China. And we'll talk about those a little bit later in the episode. But they've been around for a long time. The Chinese, in space exploration, it's been around a lot longer than I think many people realize. And so in 1958, they began their very first satellite project. This is right around the same time as Sputnik.
Right.
But it would take, a few extra years. They would launch their first satellite in 1965. I have here in my notes that, this wouldn't actually be successful, this 1965 launch, but, it's still showing that they're maybe a little bit behind, but not nearly as far behind as maybe a lot of people would assume. In 1970, though, the launch of the Dongfeng Hong-1 would make China the fifth country to independently launch a satellite. And so this is sort of off the back of the success. China would then create the China National Space Administration, the country's first official space agency. And of course, there would be a lot of other things happening here. But then in 2003, China would successfully launch the Shenzhou 5, making China just the third country to send a human into space independently. So prior to that, it was, the US and Soviet Union / Russia that would have sent humans into space independently of anybody else. 2003, China does it. And so that's actually pretty monumental. And that dates back pretty far, right? That's now 20 years ago, at a time when China was not nearly as wealthy as it is today.
Right.
So they've been able to have much larger investiture today in space administration. That's going to play a lot into sort of the story as it unfolds today. Just really briefly, I'm going to talk really quickly about Europe, because we often think about NASA as being a sole entity, a US entity, but it's worth pointing out that they're often in partnership with Europe, which has its own space agency called the European Space Agency. There's a lot of history that goes into it, but I kind of just want to make a couple quick points here before we move on. And that is, have you ever heard of the Hubble Space Telescope?
Of course. Of course. I mean, not of course, but I have. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's I would say it's a very famous telescope. It's something that was launched in 1990, has created some of the very first photorealistic sort of images of deep space that we've ever been able to perceive. Some very fantastic images. And we often attribute that as a NASA project, but it was actually a dual project by the European Space Agency and NASA. And so, right. Okay. So that they have a huge hand in, the exploration of deep space. They would also have a huge hand in the more recent launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. So again, I just want to call out both of these because China is operating a lot sooner than I think a lot of people give them credit for. And I think Europe is doing a lot of stuff that oftentimes maybe gets misattributed, misappropriated to NASA, or at least solely appropriated to NASA. And in fact, these are two other really large organizations that actually have contributed quite a bit to this arena and provides us a little bit more context and a little bit more geography to our story today. There are other space agencies out there. It's not just these four. I have here that, Today, there are over 80 independent space authorities associated with various countries. India also has a large space agency. They've done a lot of really cool things. We're not going to get into each one of them, but just know that, especially in today's age when a lot of countries need satellites for their own purposes, whatever that might be to, help them do things on the ground, that necessitates this need to have their own space agency. And so now 80 independent, countries have a space agency of some sort. That's probably around 2/5 of all countries on the planet now have some sort of space agency, depending on how you're counting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the United Nations recognizes somewhere in the order of 193. I might be off by a few, so that's a bunch of them for sure.
That's a bunch of them. Yeah, that's quite a lot. Yeah, so there's just a lot out there. But even more to that point, there's now a sort of a third party that's sort of involved, and that is the direct involvement of private space corporations. And we're going to talk a lot about private space corporations in a little bit, because right now we need to do ads.
Time for a quick ad break. We will be right back.
And we are back. We're talking about the modern day space race, or we're kind of starting to build up to it at this point. We just ran through the space shuttle program and some of the other maybe multinational, or I shouldn't say multinational, other national entities that are involved in the space race today, and sort of maybe a little bit of their history. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of the rise of the private space corporation and sort of more of their direct involvement in space exploration, rather than as a consulting sort of arm, a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Something that's sort of sitting in the background, that's not really taking a lot of the limelight from an organization such as NASA. These organizations are very much at the forefront.
This is all 21st century stuff, right?
This is all 21st century stuff. In fact, the first company we're going to talk about is a company that's called SpaceX. Hunter, have you ever heard of SpaceX?
I have heard of SpaceX. I don't know tons about it, but I've certainly heard of it before.
Yeah, SpaceX it's probably the most well-known private space company. It was founded in 2002, so basically right on the eve of right after the 21st century. So, right. To what you just said, everything we're talking about today is very much 21st century. SpaceX is a private space company that is owned by Elon Musk, and so people probably better associate Elon Musk with Tesla. It's a car company, electric car company. If you're not familiar with them, I think he also owns Twitter today. SpaceX today has launched a number of missions for NASA and is largely the company that is responsible for getting the U.S. its ability to get astronauts into space after the space shuttle program was retired. So prior to SpaceX developing a crewed spacecraft, NASA astronauts would fly on Russian rockets. And well, that worked out kind of well in the past. It's kind of nice that it's starting to happen now, in recent years, because the relationship between the U.S. and Russia has deteriorated, I would say, over the last few years. I don't think that's a shock to anybody.
Right. That's not going out on a limb. Yeah.
That's not really going on.
So it's interesting that this gets basically outsourced to private industry at this point.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's kind of a lot of America. It's kind of the American way, the U.S. way, in a lot of things, right? We like to think of the U.S. as being, I guess, a builder unto themselves. But a lot of times, even within sort of your state and local governments, what they're doing is they're contracting out to a private company to go in and do those things. Building a road, building a train, that kind of stuff. It's usually a private company that's actually doing it, not whatever governmental entity is sort of overseeing it.
Yeah.
And so in this case, SpaceX was contracted by NASA to build a spacecraft to do, and I think it's called the Dragon 2, that actually gets people up into space. One really cool thing that SpaceX managed to do is land so it's called a well, I guess I'll rephrase this. What they managed to do was vertically land a rocket booster so that it could be reused again and again. And so if we go back to talking about the space shuttle, and sort of one of the aspects was to try and reduce the cost, if you could reuse something over and over again, you sort of have this very iconic image of the space shuttle going up, and has a space shuttle sitting in the front, has a big fat rocket sitting right behind it, and two smaller rockets sitting on its side. So those three rockets that were sitting on its side, those eventually would depart. They would fall into the ocean, and you would never see them again. Well, you would see them again, but you would never use them again. They were done. They were toast.
Right.
They were, whatever they did with them afterwards. And that's very expensive, right? And so the idea here is that, what SpaceX is trying to do, and I guess has at least been somewhat successful at, is to use one of those rockets, then have that rocket re-land itself on a platform so that it could then be reused. And so that's a very important part of bringing the cost down of traveling to space. And so that's probably one of the coolest things I would say SpaceX has done in terms of pure engineering feats, because if you can imagine all the math that we talked about last week and blasting off into space and everything that goes that, now you have to almost reverse that math to then get it to land back safely on the planet. And I'm sure it's, if not as complicated, it could very well be more complicated. There are some other companies that we'll just sort of note here. We'll talk a little bit about these. Well, we'll talk about one of them a little bit more, but just some other notable companies to include would be Blue Origin. This is owned by Jeff Bezos, sort of, of Amazon fame. There's Virgin Galactic. It's founded by Richard Branson. Side note, I'm not really sure. Richard Branson's a very wealthy man. I'm not actually sure where he got most of his money from. It seems like he's just created all these little Virgin branded properties.
Yeah, I mean, from those businesses, I guess, because there's Virgin Airways, there was a music arm, there was all these different businesses. So, and I don't know how he initially made his money, but yeah, he's got this whole swath of businesses named Virgin.
Yep. There's the Sierra Nevada Corporation, which is a less known company. They're not quite as much in the limelight, but they are working on some contracts to actually build NASA vehicles. And they've actually been doing this since the 1960s. So they were kind of like Rockwell International. They were sort of working a lot on these projects in sort of the background. Now they're taking more of a front row seat in a lot of these things. There's Boeing, of course. They're a big aspect of aeronautics in general. Lockheed Martin's involved there. There's more and more and more. There's a lot of companies that are now more heavily involved directly in space flight through their own money, rather than before when it was all on the backs of a government contract. Now, of course, government contracts, through NASA and all these things do factor into it pretty heavily, right? For example, SpaceX gets a lot of their money by simply launching satellites up into space for not only NASA, but for Europe, but for Brazil, but for all these other countries that just need satellites up into space. And as a private entity, they're able to do that, right? They're able to offer their services to other countries for a profit. That's their motive. Most of these companies are trying to launch their own vessels, either for their own missions or as part of a bid to win lucrative contracts by agencies such as NASA. It's probably safe to say that SpaceX is the most successful so far, at least in terms of accomplishments, right? So we've talked a little bit about the Dragon 2 capsule. But despite most of these companies' influence on the technology and the vessels and everything like that we use to get to space today, they still don't really control where they launch from. And so that leads us into a really fun discussion on the geography of launch sites.
Ooh, interesting.
Which is, it'll be fun. It'll be fun. So Hunter, where do you think is the most advantageous region of the world to launch things into space?
I'm just thinking of a couple of facilities I know that happen to be in Florida. So I'm not sure if that's being close to water is important, or I'm thinking of other ones that might be in the desert. I don't know. I don't really have a good answer for that question.
No, it's interesting because I think to your point, being close to water is absolutely an aspect of where launch sites are traditionally located, although there's some variations here. technically the most advantageous spot to launch something from space is to be as close to the equator as possible, and then launching at a specific angle. And I don't have it here in my notes, but launching at a specific angle in order to be able to use the rotational force of the Earth to help propel yourself into space, right? So you can sort of use the power. Now, of course, that doesn't always work because not every country, can have a spaceport on the equator. There's very few
close
places.
to the equator, right? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, there's very few places, very few countries that are actually on the equator, and so you have to sort of make your decisions based on a number of other factors, including some place like Florida. And so we'll talk a little bit more about sort of Florida and some of these locations. But of course, as we're talking about this, there's sort of two categories of launches. They kind of have a different needs around geography, right? There's the need to just launch stuff up there, satellites, things, whatever.
Stuff that people aren't in.
Exactly. And the other one would be things that people are in, right? And so as it turns out, there's a lot more places that you can safely launch things into space than there are safely launch people into space. And I think a lot of this from my research just has to do with the variabilities that are there. Obviously, when you're launching people, you want it to be a lot more variably safe. If you ultimately lose a satellite, which does happen every now and then, there's actually, a long list of recent failed launches of rockets and satellites and everything like that. It's not good for the pocketbook, but ultimately it's not as tragic. And so I think that plays a lot into it. And so historically, there have been two primary sites that have launched humans into space. Do you know where these sites are?
Are they the ones in Florida?
One of them is, yeah.
Okay.
So one of them is the Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral, although Cape Canaveral isn't used anymore. The Kennedy Space Center is responsible for about 147-ish launches into space. For people. The other would be, do you have any guesses for where the other one might be?
Is it in the United States, or are we looking at somewhere else in the world?
It's elsewhere in the world.
I mean, I'm just guessing Russia because of all the things we've talked about already.
I mean, that's a really good guess, right? Because obviously during the time when the shuttle program was gone, obviously we know that the U.S. had to rely on Russians to blast themselves into space, especially during the Soviet Union. They had to have been blasting themselves off into space somewhere within their sphere of influence. But it wasn't directly Russia itself. Instead, they always launched, even to this day, at a place called the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan.
Interesting.
This specific launch place has been responsible for somewhere around 140 human launches into space. So Kennedy Space Center has a slight edge. If we factor in Cape Canaveral, there's quite a bit more of an edge towards launches from the U.S. There are two other places, however, that launch people into space. Do you have any wild guesses where these other two places might be?
Well, you've been talking about the successes of the Chinese space agency, or whatever they call it there. So I'm guessing one could be in China.
Absolutely right. Yes. Okay. China is now the third country to host a actual place to launch people into space. And this is at the Jiuquan, I might be mispronouncing that, Satellite Launch Center. Don't let the name fool you. It's where they historically launched satellites, and they've now recently, as of just 2003, launched people into space as well.
Okay.
I guess that hasn't come with a name change. This would also be one that's significantly inland. The Kazakhstan one, I believe, is sort of near the Caspian Sea, so that provides a little bit of a water buffer there. This one is significantly inland. It's actually kind of in the north central part of China, almost on the border of Mongolia. So it's pretty far away from the ocean. So if something goes wrong, that stuff is landing on land. That said, if you're at all familiar with Chinese and Mongolian geography, there's actually not that much around that area. So they must be thinking, it's probably
in terms of
safe.
Human settlement.
In terms of human settlement, yes. There's no there's not going to be a large city. They're not flying over a large city necessarily. obviously there are humans spread out everywhere, and there's wildlife and trees and all this other stuff. But I think that's sort of their argument is, we can sort of launch here. And I think the variability of there makes it pretty safe overall. The other one is, and I'm not going to ask you where this one is because I don't think you would guess it, because it's kind of unique. It is a place called Corn Ranch, Texas.
Okay.
And Corn Ranch, Texas is the only, as far as I can tell, the only private spaceport that can launch humans. And so it is owned by...
not run by any government, in other
no,
words.
not run by any government. As far as I can tell, again, I believe this is entirely private. Unlike the other spaceports, it is entirely owned by a man named Jeff Bezos of Amazon fame, who also owns the Blue Origin space company. And so to date, there's only been suborbital launches located here. But I believe the intention is that Blue Origin's crewed launches would take off from here in the future as well, from my research. And that would make it very unique because now it's a wholly independent sort of launch site. I mean, it's regulated by the FAA. I'm sure, there are other sort of governmental entities that, make sure that everything's going to be functioning safe, right? You're launching something from Texas. There's a lot of people who live in Texas. Obviously, it's a little bit far away, but there's still possibilities of something happening. So they must have been thinking about all of this.
So a suborbital launch, is that in space technically then? Or is it
technically
gray
it
area,
gets up to the
maybe?
point where there's like, as far as I could tell, where there's a little bit of, it's like that middle ground between full gravitational pull and no gravitation.
Okay.
Right? You can you can feel it. You can see space. You sort of get that horizon view.
You can see the Earth. Yeah.
You can see the Earth. Yeah. But you're not technically in space, right? You can still, if you didn't have rockets, you would still get pulled back down in. And that's obviously the case for a lot of satellites as well. They're in more of a suborbital thing. And sort of they correct, or they've been positioned in a way so that they will fly through the orbit for a long period of time before eventually sinking back in. And so this idea for Blue Origin, while they're also going after contracts, NASA contracts, and they want to, be involved in this area, they also have a pretty sizable hand in trying to commercialize space travel. And so they, selling seats, getting, people who are quite wealthy up into space so that they can experience.
This is
that.
like William Shatner, kind of situation.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if you recall that he went in space.
I do, yeah.
With Blue Origins somewhat recently.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point. There's some other notable launch sites. So this would include the Vandenberg Air Force Base. That's here in the United States. They've launched quite a few things up in space, not people. There's the Guyana Space Center, which we'll talk about in just a second. Then there's the Satish Dhawan Space Center in India. And so these are, other places that are starting to have more involvement in actually launching things into space. And so let's talk a little bit about the Guyana Space Center because it's a little bit interesting. So this spaceport is also called Europe's spaceport because it's predominantly where the ESA launches their missions from.
Okay.
And this can quickly dovetail into a bigger conversation about, why is Europe spaceport in some place called French Guiana? But it's because French Guiana is actually, it's France. It's in South America.
It's a colony. It's a territory that France claims.
Yeah. It is. Yeah. It's wholly owned by France.
Controlled by France.
And it's because of that, that's where they've been able to put their spaceport, which happens to be, Hunter, really close to the equator. And so that made for a very logistically advantageous place to put a spaceport. And so the Guyana spaceport is very active. They've launched over 300 rockets into space. Not quite as active as Florida and the Kazakhstan Cosmodrome, but still very active overall. And this is where something like the James Webb Space Telescope was launched from. So very famous launching, right? There was a lot of hopes riding on that, getting into space safely and being able to function properly. And so, maybe we'll just talk very briefly about the International Space Station, just to close out this segment, because while we've talked a lot about launch sites and private companies, there's been this sort of ever-present sort of space stations floating in air. Hunter, what is the International Space Station?
It is a facility that is in orbit around the Earth that astronauts can fly to, and then they stay, some of them for over a year or something like that. And they conduct research. And it's not a permanent, but a semi-permanent station for scientific research, I'm guessing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's the largest modular space station in sort of low Earth orbit, so not suborbital, but it's low Earth orbit. To date, it's a project that's run by the United States NASA, Russia's Roscosmos, Japan's JAXA, Europe's ESA, and Canada's CSA, which stands for Canadian Space Authority or Administration. It was sort of started in 1984. Canada, under President Reagan, Canada joined the effort shortly after, and then all the other countries that are kind of involved sort of joined in as well. Apparently, the station, I thought this was really interesting, is divided into two sections. And so with habitat sort of, modules attached to them in both sections. And there's the Russian orbital segment, which is operated by Russia. And then there's the United States orbital segment, which is run by the United States, as well as the other countries. So even
in space, there's some national territoriality going on here on the space
It's very
station.
interesting. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure. I've seen pictures, and they're all like, it's not big, right?
It's not like a lot of space, right? It's not you can take a walk around the block or something. Yeah,
but it is interesting how they've sort of divided themselves up like that. So it's just kind of an interesting split there. From what I can tell, it's all jovial when people are up there. They're not really taking
at least those are the images we get to see, right?
Yeah, exactly. Regardless, the International Space Station, despite the split, does stand as kind of like a shining beacon of countries binding together as sort of a shared goal. So unlike sort of the modern space race or the past space race, this is a time when countries pooled their collective resources, as countries, as governmental entities, and there wasn't a lot of blowing raspberries at each other.
Right.
The ISS is still up there. It's home to 7 people at the moment. And so that would be Frank Rubio, Sergei Prokopyev, Dmitry Petelin, Stephen Bowen, Warren Hoberg, Sultan Al-Nayati, and Andrei Fedyev. These are all men, but it should be pointed out that there are women up there frequently as well. It just happens to be a time when there's all men up there. It's a roughly even mix between NASA and Roscosmos astronauts right now. Sometimes there's ESA, sometimes there's Canadians. Again,
do you know
Japanese.
The difference between a cosmonaut and an astronaut?
Do I know what the difference is?
Yes.
I thought it was one word was for what they called it in Russia, and the other here in the United States.
That's correct. That's the answer. And in fact, there's another term that's used for somebody who's trained to go into space from China, and that's a taikonaut.
Interesting.
Apparently. Yeah. Huh. So again, the national identity, the sort of territory of things, even flavors what we call people who are in space, and so that their attachments to places in Earth follow them into space.
Exactly. That's so fascinating. I had not heard taikonaut before. But speaking of China, because we have a little bit of, we were talking about the International Space Station.
Segue.
Yeah, nice segue. China has their own space station up in space. And so it's called the Tiangong Space Station. Apparently, Chinese taikonauts or astronauts are not allowed to go into the International Space Station.
Okay.
That was something that was signed in 2011. Congress prohibited NASA from cooperating substantially with its Chinese counterpart without express prior authorization. The law, known as the Wolf Amendment, makes it very difficult for China to participate in the International Space Station if the country even wanted to, which there hasn't seemed to be much interest in China actually participating in it. They've always sort of had their own ambitions there. And so China is not an ISS partner, and no Chinese astronaut has ever visited the space station. Instead, they go up to the Tiangong space station. And so this kind of, we start to see the story here, right? It's starting to devolve a little bit into a current space race, and with sort of maybe some Cold War undertones, not quite the same, but definitely similar, right?
Like we could say geopolitical undertones,
Geopolitical.
perhaps.
Yeah. Geopolitical undertones where now there's this era of the International Space Station being, very collaborative with, Russia, who was a former adversary, back then, again, current adversary today, but at the time, binding together, pooling resources. Now we're sort of going back to a time when maybe this is something that we've already sort of seen back in the mid 1900s. And so with that, before we launch into, the geopolitics of the modern space race, let's do our last ad break for the episode.
Please stay tuned and we'll be right back.
And we are back. We are finishing up our 2-part series on the space race. This episode is mostly focused on the current space race as it's happening today. In fact, this next section is really starting to dive into what is the current space race. And Hunter, if you can believe it, well, actually, I'll ask you this. What is the current space race about?
I'm guessing it's control over satellites, maybe in some part, control over what's floating around in space.
Kind of.
And I know that Antarctica, let's go to Earth for a second here. Antarctica is not controlled by any particular country, but that there are countries who have laid claim to it so that if that arrangement changes, they would stake a territorial claim. And there are maps that demonstrate this. I'm imagining in my head, although I've never seen it, a map of space that countries have started to carve up territory or something like that. Anyways, that's where my mind goes with the space race. I don't know if that's true or not.
I mean, everything you said is absolutely true. There's a lot of geopolitics involved in sort of satellites and like all this stuff up in space. In fact, I would say that the modern day space race is about the largest satellite up there. In fact, something we've talked about extensively over this 2-part series.
Would that be the moon?
It is the moon. It is
back
absolutely
to the moon.
the moon.
All right.
It seemed to, I mean, they say time is cyclical. And in this case, it is very close to feeling like a circle because we are heading right back to the moon. So despite landing on the moon in the 1960s, today the United States has made a renewed effort to get to the moon once again. And you might think that, we had technology back in the 60s, very rudimentary computers and all, technology overall. Why is it so hard to get back there? But, of course, things have become a little bit more complicated. There's technology that doesn't adapt well to what they used in the past. And unfortunately, to our point, I think when we made earlier was that, we sort of gave up on going to the moon after just a few short tries because it was kind of a been there, done that thing. And sort of a lot of that expertise and knowledge sort of dissipated a little bit. And so they kind of need to rebuild a lot of that knowledge with technology that's a lot more advanced, but needs to be adapted to this new reality. And the other thing to note here is that as the US and China, as we're going to find out, start to undergo this renewed effort to get to the moon, the idea of a singular visit is no longer, that's not the goal anymore. And that right. Also plays a lot into this. There is the ultimate goal to have a full-on lunar base established on the moon.
Right, because these space stations we were just speaking of, they have a lifespan, right? I mean, everything's got a lifespan, I suppose, any building, any structure. But,
totally.
2031, that's going to be the end of, that's at the moment, that could change. But that's the idea, is that they'll decommission the ISS at that point. But I suppose if you were to establish something on the moon, maybe it could run a lot longer, maybe. And so maybe that's the aspiration.
Well, I think so, right? I think the idea is, you would have a permanent, indefinite military base, or I shouldn't say military base, but
right. But that's maybe what's really happening here.
But I think the military plays a large hand into it, right? And being able to have something up there. And then I think, if we think even longer term ambitions, if you can establish a permanent base on the moon, you can almost start to build vessels that would be built for longer range trips into places like Mars. Then that would be built and launched from the moon.
It's like a rest stop on the way to Mars.
Well, it wouldn't even be a rest stop. You would have one vehicle that goes from the Earth to the moon, drops off the astronauts, and then this vehicle would be wholly built on the moon. And I think there's some advantages to that. I didn't dive too much into that, but I think that's kind of the ideas that are at play here.
One of the things, just to slip back for a second, that we didn't speak about when we talked about the space race in the context of the Cold War was in the 1980s, there was an enormous amount of talk about a missile defense system that would be installed in space.
Is it Star Wars?
Star Wars, yeah. And that was, I remember during the Reagan administration in particular, that was something I remember hearing a lot about. So maybe, this is displacing that as the next aspiration for, scientific / military base in space.
Well, and we're going to have a bonus episode that comes attached with these. So, subscribe over on Substack if you want to listen to that. But it's going to be about the Space Force, the U.S. Space Force.
The what?
That is, a new military branch. And, that sort of narrative feeds right into sort of that, right? There's now a strategic defense importance to space that they were starting to conceive of in the 1980s, but probably weren't able to act on as easily as they are, I think, getting to the point today. But let's keep moving along. So establishing of a lunar base, very important. And of course, this is all being driven by competition, not with the Soviet Union this time, but of course with China. And so China is, really, investing a lot of money into space exploration. And now US and NASA trying to, once again, prove that they are technologically superior is now starting to invest more and more money into this as well. And it's really this rivalry that's spearheading a lot of the innovations that are happening within NASA today. So despite being relatively late to the party, China has made considerable technological progress towards exploring space, in many ways outpacing NASA, right? So NASA was, their budget had been cut consistently throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s, especially with something like the Great Recession. Now they're starting to get more budget. And it's sort of because China has sort of been so quickly advancing in this area. So in 2019, China's Chang'e 4 spacecraft successfully landed on the far side of the moon, a first time that's ever happened. Right? We visited the sunny side, we've not visited the far side.
But this was without people, right?
This is without people. It's just a rover, but still a huge technological achievement. Yep. And like NASA, China has now also managed to land rovers on Mars. Right? So they have a little Mars rover over there, transmitting data back and doing scientific research just like NASA's rover is doing. So that's, starting to feel like more on par. The development and construction of its own space station was also a very impressive feat. If you remember the International Space Station, that was not just NASA, that was a lot of different organizations pooling their resources. Right. China went ahead and did that mostly unto themselves. Of course, it's not quite as big, but, it's still very impressive. Essentially, basically, China has kind of been on a space exploration roll lately. And that has put a lot of people in NASA and the United States a little bit on edge. So because of this, because of all of this renewed effort, especially around the moon with respects to China, NASA has shelved its plan to get humans on Mars first. That had been a plan throughout basically, I wouldn't want to say from like 2002 to up to 2013 or so. That was sort of the plan. It was like, let's get people to Mars. And that's why we had so many Mars rover programs. They sort of shelved that idea, let's return our focus back to the moon, because now this is heating up in other areas of the planet in terms of geopolitics. So today, the effort to put humans back on the moon has really devolved into two camps. There's the US-led effort by NASA, which has been joined by 21 other countries, many of which are European, but there's also Brazil, Japan, South Korea, and India. And this is the program that is called Artemis, who I now know is the god of the moon.
Goddess of the moon.
Goddess of the moon, I should say. And then there's the Chinese-led effort, which is primarily China and Russia, which is called the Chinese Lunar Exploration Project. And so just to dive into both of these a little bit, the Artemis, according to the plan for Artemis, the expectation is to do a crewed lunar flyby in 2024, a crewed lunar landing in 2025, complete the construction of a lunar gateway, which is a moon space station, in 2028, and then have yearly lunar landings from that point on, with the eventual goal to establish a lunar base that would be built sometime after that.
So they're going to put up a small facility and with hopes and aspirations of building something larger.
Exactly, right. The idea is to now have a space station that's circulating, the moon, and from there you can just bring astronauts to the station. You can do, visits almost with regular occurrence, right? You no longer have to figure out the exact trajectory and all that, all the complications that come with that. However, this timeline at this point kind of seems unrealistic. It seems like everything's been delayed and all this kind of stuff. So I don't have an updated timeline here, but I would be shocked if this all happened in the next year.
Yeah, and if we had a timeline, these timelines get extended for all kinds of different reasons, as we've seen with technology and having to make sure that there's the safety issue and everything, and so. But it's interesting to think that the aspiration was to get something done in the next few years, really.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't think the lunar flyby, I don't think that's delayed by much. I think that might be like 2025 now.
Okay.
And of course that could still get delayed, but I think it's getting to the point where it's getting pretty close. The other stuff I think is a little more aspirational. And so everything sort of builds off of each other, and we'll see how that gets extended. The Chinese lunar exploration project, meanwhile, is a little bit more secretive. We don't have all of the details, and I don't think that should be a surprise to anybody. The China and Russia, they don't exactly share a lot of information. They're not that kind of governmental entity, but there's some stuff that we know. So apparently, China wants to have a crewed lunar landing sometime in the early 2030s, and so if every sort of timeline, lands just right where it's at, this would be about 5 years after the NASA landing. But again, that's probably going to get delayed, and I don't know if China's is also suffering delays. It could or it could not. Have no information on that. They would want to have a full lunar base, however, established on the moon by 2035.
Okay.
And so in 2021, just now a couple of years ago, China and Russia announced that they will be building a moon base together. Oh. I'm unsure of how involved Russia actually is. It could be a lot, it could be a little, no idea. They've also formally invited more countries and international organizations to join what they call the International Lunar Research Station Project. And so apparently Pakistan and the United Arab Emirates are also part of this project. Again, I'm totally unclear on how heavily involved they are. Could be a lot, could be some, could be almost nothing. The whole project feels much more Chinese to me than anything else. It definitely seems like China is the dominant player and the dominant force behind this. So those are the two competing efforts. And so there's this other aspect, which is the ongoing race to Mars. And that's kind of what we already sort of started to allude to. Elon Musk, for example, has been quite vocal about getting humans on Mars for colonization efforts. I think NASA simply wants to explore, and they want to sort of, like they did with the moon originally, they want to be the first to be able to have humans on Mars. I don't want to dive too deeply into Mars because it gets a little bit beyond what we can reasonably predict what will happen. Like it's so far out there. So instead, I think as we close out today's episode, Hunter, I think it might be worth just spending a little, maybe our last few minutes here discussing some of the criticisms that have been levied at this idea of colonization of other planets, because we can talk a lot about sort of how cool it would be to land people on Mars and how cool it would be to have a lunar base and how cool it might be to have, human civilization pop up on Mars. But there's a lot of criticisms that are worth talking about, and, maybe some of the things that the people in charge aren't really thinking about or maybe not emphasizing enough. And so we can discuss these, as much as we kind of want, but, we'll kind of start at the sort of the huge financial costs of this.
Right. Looked at how much it costs to even get the space shuttle up for a single flight. The idea of constructing a satellite, some kind of station that is a satellite around the moon and then establishing a base on the moon, that's going to cost a lot.
it will cost it'll cost a lot of money, right? For all of this stuff to come together. And it starts to lead into a conversation of, well, if we're spending this amount of money on, multiple hundreds of billions of dollars on getting people to, a handful of people to live on the moon.
Right.
As compared to
all the money that was spent to get a total of 12 people onto the moon, for example, just for a day or less.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it begs the question, maybe we could be spending the money on something else. I mean, it's fascinating for the imagination to think about having a colony or a base on the moon or even Mars. But, we've got some pretty big issues on the planet Earth. And, maybe we should be spending some, all the resources we have addressing the inequities and the suffering and that is going on with people on the planet.
Yeah. And, there is and I'll just call this out, there's a sort of indefinable value in sort of these achievements and sort of what they're able to push people to imagine next, right? I think we can all agree that, just the fact that somebody can do something like this has probably led to some other discoveries or people, wanting to whatever. But to your point, I think, in an age where, things like, poverty is getting worse, inequality is getting worse, and, things like climate change is getting worse, investing so much of this money into space travel does feel a little unfair, to say the least. Right.
And it's sort of, there's so many science fiction is our guide here a little bit, right? Because science fiction is a medium for where we articulate the concerns we have about what's happening right now and wrap it up in a story that seems super fantastical. But, in so many, it could be Blade Runner or so many other scenarios, the idea is like, well, we've trashed the Earth, so we need to move on, right? Exactly. And that's maybe not the attitude we should be going with. I don't know.
No, that is, I think that's where I wanted to head next. It's like, okay, we didn't take care of Earth, therefore somebody like Elon Musk wants us to colonize Mars. And then it becomes this conversation of, well, who is this for? Right. So if you say we establish some, perfect, beautiful Mars, place, it's terraformed, maybe it's green again. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of science fiction-y type things.
Right.
Well, who's actually going to be living up there?
Right. Who gets to go? I mean, even these kinds of class and cultural politics, sociopolitics are played out in these various science fiction things. And that's exactly what's going on, is that there's an elite that's involved in being able to access this technology, and most people are left out of that.
Yeah, there was a science fiction film that covered this somewhat, I think, called Elysium. Similar sort of idea of like, well, Earth is for, the discarded of the humanity, the poor of humanity, the people who, simply couldn't afford to escape it because, we had demolished it, we had ruined it. And now everything else, everything above it is no longer, that's not for you.
or I don't know if you've seen the movie Gattaca, which, right. And that's another one where, it's only the biologically elite, right? Those who have been tested and who have a certain biological profile of living a long time and having certain abilities, who have all the privilege in the world. And those are the ones that are being able to go to, the colony, I think on the moon, I think it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this leads to like maybe a conversation on sort of colonialism at large, something that humanity is well accustomed to historically. And like, is that something that we need to bring up into space at all? Right. This idea of we need to
spread. But all the things to export off the planet, should that be one of them? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Right. The idea that, this becomes, our domain and, there's arguments, that, I can see somebody making. It's like, well, there's nothing living on Mars, X, Y, Z. But all that's to say is, there's sort of a bad history of colonialism in general. And it's like, how much of that do you continue wanting to engage with as a human?
Well, I mean,
human
if you
trait?
think about the materials that are put into this technology, rocket technology, there is a very intense geography of that happens here. And then these, particular materials and things that are coming from countries where there's environmental damage, where there are, human rights that are not observed. And so that this effort to get to the moon, for example, or Mars, will have huge ramifications on the well-being of people on Earth. And so that, that continues and amplifies some of the inequities that already exist. And that's something that, we can put on the table to discuss if we're talking about something like this.
Exactly. And I think just to close this out here, the last sort of criticism I wanted to, and I have more here, but we're kind of running short on time, but it's just to talk about sort of, we've talked a lot about the money involved, the inequalities of spending all this money to get up stuff. And I think there's a criticism to be laid here around sort of the unrealistic expectations of what we're putting all this money into, and that we're putting all this money into something that could very well just be impossible. We simply don't know if we can actually, for example, sustain ourselves on a place like Mars or the moon, right? In which case this all becomes for naught, and we've just wasted a lot of resources and time and money and all this stuff on something that is simply just not feasible, because we are of Earth, we evolved here on Earth, and that might just be where we're destined to stay. And I know a lot of people don't like to think about that because there's a lot of like science fiction that's really fun to explore, but we haven't proven otherwise yet.
Right.
And I think that maybe that's not a good excuse to not do something. Obviously, there's a lot of things you need to do and try, but it is a criticism worth exploring. Like, okay, this could all be for naught, in which case, what have we done? What have we accomplished for it?
We spent billions of dollars and not actually realize what we set out to do, which again, we can debate how useful that is for most people anyway.
Mm-hmm. Now, all that said, I am a big fan of, NASA and spaceflight. I think it's really fun I think doing all of this could have some benefits here and there. I think we have some very real problems down on Earth that still need to get solved. But I am generally a fan of space exploration and trying to sort of push, the bounds of sort of science and human sort of exploration. And so I'm pretty encouraged by some of these things. And I hope that overall, whether it's China or the US or what have you, I hope overall we get sort of a similar feeling that came out of the original space race, which is a more of a symbol of human unity, that humans can sort of bind together and overcome insurmountable odds. And I think that's sort of my biggest takeaway, leaving these 2 episodes behind. And so with that, Hunter, let's do our pluggables one last time.
Thanks, Geoff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portlandist, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle with David Banas, and co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, and my name is Geoff Gibson. I am the co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. But you can also find me on YouTube. That's youtube.com/little Geography by Geoff. If you want to watch more of my videos, they're a little bit shorter, a little bit more concise. If you liked what you heard today, you liked last week's episode, you liked this episode, please, and you want more geography, please go over to geographyiseverything.substack.com. We now have premium memberships. You can sign up. You can get access to even more geography, ad-free podcasts, all these extra special benefits and perks that we're sort of coming up with. And there'll be more sort of coming just as we sort of think of them. If you liked what you heard today and you're listening on something like Apple Podcasts or another app, please rate and review us. I really love seeing those. They really give... they just let us know, I should say, that what we're doing, what we're creating is valuable and entertaining, and we're doing things right here. So please keep sending those in, because again, we really like them. I think next time you listen to us, we're going to do a quasi 2-parter similar to our coffee tea episode. They're going to be separate, but we're kind of doing them together. And that is, well, Hunter, do you want to?
Geography is your pet cat and geography is your pet dog, right?
Cats and dogs.
That's right.
Yeah,
Bring it back to Earth. That's right.
It should be a fun one. Hunter has cats. I have a dog. So we're going to take those respective episodes to lead, and we're going to have some fun with it, I think. I'm really looking forward to them.
Please come back and join us. Thanks for listening.
All right. We'll see you next time.